Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well, and welcome to Living Torah. And tonight's share is going to focus on something particularly unique and especially meaningful in the context of the life of every Jew. In fact, really the life of every human being. And it all relates to one very specific theme that our Torah portion focuses on. The theme is sometimes you have to do what you have to do, regardless of how you feel about it. Why? Because you know it is the right thing to do. And that applies in the context of personal relationships, of our friendships, of our life goals, and of our spiritual aspirations. If I was to ask you to consider the two most common quotes that are uttered on the lips of mankind, which really encapsulates the apathy that so erodes our lives, they are, "I'm not in the mood," or "I can't be bothered." The problem is that when you are no longer in the mood, or you simply can't be bothered, then the end result is you stop investing the time, you stop investing the energy, and you stop investing whatever is required in order for you to get the job done. And then over the course of time, whatever it is that you were committed to doing in the first instance ultimately just simply falls by the wayside. And the reason why that relates very specifically to our Torah portion this week is because the words start with Zos Chukas Torah. This is the ultimate statute of the Torah. Statute is what we call a supra-rational principle, something that we do regardless of the fact that we don't understand the rationale behind it. It's not an irrational principle, it's a supra-rational principle. By definition, there is some kind of method to the madness, as it were, but not one that is comprehensible to the human being. And the significance of that sort of law beyond rational principles or testimonials and what have you is because they're there to condition us to the fact that not always do we have to get it, not always do we have to understand. And when we choose to otherwise always insist on comprehending what we're doing, and therefore when we don't necessarily appreciate it or it no longer appeals to our sensibility, we abandon it because I'm not in the mood or I can't be bothered. Well, we all know where that leads to. My grandfather, Olav Shalom, used to say, before marriage, he'll walk to the other end of the world for you. After marriage, he won't even go to the local grocery store. Plain and simply put, before marriage, he's interested in attracting, wants to make a big impression, do whatever is necessary. After marriage, maybe apathy sets in. She's not in the mood. He can't be bothered, because you get to a stage where you no longer need to, or you feel you no longer need to apply the same effort. So with that in mind, let me tell you a story about a guy called Lawrence. True story. Lawrence is a member of the Shul who runs a menswear shop, or ran for many years, in the city of London. It's not a particularly big shop, but he's made great success of it. And he's got muzzled. In fact, many years ago, there was a fire in King's Cross train station. Way back when, you might remember, it was bad. And as a result, they determined that they needed new emergency exits. And one of them would have effectively opened directly into where Lawrence's shop was. So they served him a forced possession order where they're going to effectively force him to sell his shop to them in order to build his emergency exit. So he had a closing down sale. Everybody loves a closing down sale. Everybody shops at a closing down sale because even though the prices have been marked down from 400% to 350% markup, in your mind, you're still getting a deal. You're still getting a mitzvah. So they serve him that forced order, but they end up doing the exits elsewhere. Problem is, somebody forgot to tell him, or not forgot around to telling him, that they're no longer pursuing this forced order sale of his shop. So they kept it in place. And God bless the British, for 18 years, I kid you not, for 18 years, Lawrence had a closing down sale. And people just kept piling in all of the time. Now, several years ago, somebody somewhere got wind of it finally. I don't know why or how, but the sale finally ended because some bureaucrat realized a clerical error. And Lawrence comes to me on a Shabbos at Kiddush. He says, "Rabbi, I want to branch out. I want to open another huge shop right at the bottom of the Merrill Lynch building in the city, right near St. Paul's Cathedral. The lease will be a fortune. I want your blessing." This is at the Kiddush. So I gave him a blessing. But I told him he has to ensure to keep the shop closed on Shabbos, and he agreed. And we said l'chaim, and business continued over there to boom as well, thank God. And And then he opened another shop around the corner for women's suits, which closed after 6 months. And he came to complain to me one Shabbos. I said, Lawrence, you never asked for a blessing for the ladies' wear. And he's like, oh, yeah, okay, fair enough. But Lawrence is also something of a gambler. And so several years ago, he bought himself a horse, which he called Menorah. And he comes to me yet again for a blessing. And I told him, same deal, no Shabbos. Only this time I got smarter. I also told him that in as much as you don't race the horse on Shabbos, but when your horse does race and it does win, you have to give 10% of your winnings to a charity of my choice. And we shook and we said, L'chaim. 2 months later, he calls me up. And in his usual abrupt way, where are you? I'm at home. Are you near a computer? Yes. Go to it now and type in this web address while I stay on the phone. Okay. All right, Lawrence, it's a racing website. Watch the race, Rabbi. It's a rerun of a race that happened. I did. This horse, Menorah, is in the race. The odds are 40-1. No kidding. 40-1 on his new horse, Menorah, which is trailing way behind. The odds make sense. Menorah is somewhere in the middle now. Menorah is in second place with only 2 more rounds to go. And the presenter is ecstatic as he now announces Menorah is out in front on the last lap. My heart is beating. I know Lawrence as a gambler. He would have bet £1,000 minimum just for the heck of it. At 40-1 odds, that's £4,000 to a charity of my choice. And to my utter dismay, Menorah crosses the finish line, winning by a whisker. Wow. Lawrence, that's amazing. I can't believe it. Guess how much I bet, Rabbi? I literally hold my breath. Go on, Lawrence, tell me. Nothing. It was Shabbos. And I'm like, what? And then, good for you. You see, Lawrence did what he needed to do because he knew it was the right thing to do. He could have said, deal, shmeel, Shabbos, whatever, I'm going to make money. But he did. He kept to the terms of the deal, much as he might have otherwise not wanted to be bothered to do so. And that horse ultimately went on to win other races and whatever, and eventually used the horse for breeding, made money off it, etc. But the hard fact is that when you do what you know is the right thing to do, even if you don't want to, it'll work out to your benefit. In classic Jewish terms, is what we call Kabbalat al, accepting to do something regardless of where your emotions or your thinking features in the equation. In fact, this term, Kabbalat al, translates literally as accepting the yoke. What's a yoke? A yoke steers an animal. It may want to go in one direction, but by way of the yoke, we steer it in a different direction. Your own animalistic traits might be inclined to conduct itself one way, or simply might not want to be bothered doing the right thing, if anything at all. But your innate sense of righteousness, of spirituality, your spiritual self harnesses itself to the animal and steers it in the right direction. Indeed, our forefathers are famously referred to as the wheels on God's chariot. They may not have had animalistic inclinations, hence we don't typically ascribe to them the term Kabbalat Ol in the same way, but the principle is the same. Like a chariot, which is utterly subservient to the rider, they're equally subservient to the will of the Almighty. How do you aspire to such a level? I mean, it's high ground. How do you get there? And the answer is simply, you have to take your ego out of the equation, because the can't be bothered is prefaced with I can't be bothered. I am not in the mood. With a little more humility, with some self-abnegation, you'll do it regardless of how you feel about it. You know, when we were proclaimed as God's chosen nation, as the Jewish people, it was on account of 2 words. We will do and we will listen. The starting point is we will do, committing to doing, even before it has meaning for you, before it appeals to your sensibility. And then thereafter, there is the we will listen as well. And that, therefore, again, comes back to the underlying theme of our portion. It's a challenging one. It's short in verses, but enigmatic in its detail. I mean, everything in this portion goes right to the core of the Jewish belief system. It starts with the command about the red heifer, a wholly inexplicable law, one of which the Torah again defines as this is the ultimate statute of the Torah. King Solomon, the wisest of all men, understood through his own deep intellect the rationale even behind the statutes. But this one, even this one, he couldn't understand. This is generally, as I said earlier, whilst there are any number of statutes, there is a certain common consistency, at the very least, in their performance. This one is fraught with contradiction. The ashes are intended to purify somebody, but the guy carrying out the procedure, the priest carrying out the procedure, becomes impure in the process. He's using the ashes to sprinkle on somebody who becomes defiled or comes in contaminated spiritually by having come into contact with death. But in sprinkling the ashes, he becomes contaminated in the process. Whilst all sacrifices are always brought within the confines of the temple, this one was prepared outside the city of Jerusalem, but still whilst facing Jerusalem. Even the very color insistent upon this particular sacrifice, red, is one which ordinarily is defined as negative in Judaism. Here's the point. Again, we are comprised of body and soul. The body is the animalistic self. Left to its own devices, it tends to veer off the path. It can be destructive. It can make a mess of its intended purpose and role in this world. So God gave us the Torah, the yoke. The soul animates the body. That's the driver. Harnessed to the yoke steers us on the path of righteousness, ensuring that we fulfill our ultimate intent. And that, again, is the significance of statutes, to condition us to do what we have to do. Not because it sits comfortably with us. Sometimes you do it, however uncomfortable, however inconvenient, because it is the right thing to do. When you were a child, did you always do what you were told? No doubt, like everybody else, you constantly questioned your parents' rules and directions, often contradicted them, sometimes argued with them, and usually came up with 1,000 excuses. But when it came down to it, at the end of all the pleading, at the end of all the begging, at the end of all the resisting and the manipulating, and especially at the end of all the so-called reasoning, you ended up doing what your father or mother demanded, asked, or commanded on account of 4 irrefutable words, because I said so. Or as Buddy Hackett once said, my mother's menu consisted of 2 choices, take it or leave it. Granted, sometimes we will have as children obeyed resentfully. Sometimes we did what we were told because after those seemingly all powerful words, there wasn't any choice. It wasn't a question of how you felt. The job needed to get done and that was it. So you focused on the task at hand. If you felt anything, it was your concentration or the presence of your parents' will or your parents' desire, but your own emotions, the ones that had motivated all the hesitation and the reluctance of the defiance in the first places, they were just gone. Sometimes you even felt a kind of relief. It was as if those words, because I said so, released some hidden wellspring, allowed you to reach a deeper relationship with and a more overpowering love for your parents. Perhaps not often, but there were those moments when, because I said so, transformed not just your feelings, but your interactions, your perceptions, your very sense of who you were and why you were. And so something that had seemed so onerous and unbearable became a source of meaning, of energy, of ultimate relevance. So you see, the biggest problem with Jews through the ages was the reluctance to accept the mission irrespective of our ability to comprehend, to do what you have to do because it has to be done. Again, even if it doesn't appeal to you, or it breaches your comfort zone, or it requires you to stretch yourself beyond your immediate confines, even if you think you know better, to do it or accept it simply because this is the statute of the Torah. To be honest, discerning, humble human being, sometimes that should be more than enough. But for the rest of us, sometimes it just doesn't always work. I mean, take one example, just by way of one example. There is a mitzvah in the Torah to give tzedakah, to give charity. Not just any amount, but a minimum of 10% of our earnings. To some, it might sound a little insane. I just closed a deal. I just earned myself $100,000. I have to give away 10 grand to charity. I earn 200,000 a year. I have to give 10% of that to charity. It makes no sense. 3,000, maybe 5,000 if I'm feeling particularly generous. But 10% of my hard-earned labor defies logic. It's unacceptable. God famously, and the prophet says in Malachi, "Ubachanuni no bazot." You wonder how you can live like that? Test me, says God, and it's the only time in all of Tanakh where God says, test me and see if I won't repay you in abundance. And then God continues, it says, I will bestow blessing upon you until more than enough. Or as the Talmud adds to that, until your lips get tired from saying enough. In that one particular instance, God is actually spelling out the benefit. God is actually telling you the implicit reward if you transcend the I and submit to doing the right thing. He spells out the payback, if you have enough guts and faith to take his word for it, of why you should accept the otherwise seemingly unacceptable to your thinking. In other instances, or more precisely in most instances, you won't necessarily know the reward. But we have to be reassured that in as much as we might consider other things unacceptable, there is always inherent benefit to us in ways that we cannot imagine. Invariable reward as well, and undoubted benefit and advantage to the world at large. Because doing what you need to do, even if you don't get it right now, makes a dramatic difference to yourself and to the world around you. To be sure, and this has to be stressed, I am not advocating that we should be programmed robots. Judaism is not a cult where you're simply expected to follow blindly and ours is not to ask why. Certainly not. You have to internalize as well. You have to seek, you have to explore, you have to enhance, you have to develop your understanding. That is, after all, what Judaism looks to introduce, particularly through the mystical dimension, an enhanced appreciation and deeper spiritual connection to what one is doing in the religious sphere. We have to explore, yes, we have to discover the inherent beauty of our faith so that we pursue our responsibilities, not just as categorical imperatives or formal morality and obedience, but ultimately, yes, with a passion and with a deeper appreciation, with an internalization, so we can allow for it to transform our essence. But again, that exploration should never, ever be a prerequisite to the actual fulfillment. You can't say, first I want to get it, and then I'll do it. That's the antithesis of any religion. No, you do it, and then whilst doing it, understand better the significance of your actions. I have a poster that hangs in my office. Mark Twain famously said, when I was 17 years old, my father was so foolish and ignorant, I couldn't stand to have the old man around. When I turned 21, I was amazed as to how much the old man had learned in just 4 years. Interestingly enough, my father used to quote that to me often. And now, as I say, it hangs as a poster. What that suggests simply is that as children, we lack a certain intellectual and emotional maturity. And as we get older, we start to maybe get it a little bit more. We learn to appreciate the rationale of mom and dad's decisions. That's the balance that needs to be sought in the divine scheme of things as well. Do it in the first instance because I said so. This is the statute of the Torah. And over the course of time, yes, search, discover, learn more, explore deeper, and come to an appreciation as well. You know, rabbis get all sorts of questions. Some are probing, others are interesting. And there's always the one or two really annoying ones, like, Rabbi, my cow fell into my chicken soup. Can I still eat it? And it's then that every rabbi's limitless patience is called upon to deal with the question calmly and collectively, giving the annoying individual as much attention as you would anybody else. That's what rabbis are expected to do. And the reason I say that is because how then do we explain the reaction of the famous sage Shammai, who, when confronted with a man asking him to teach the whole Torah while standing on one foot, an annoying question, proceeded to chase him away with a stick. We always know about this man having come to Hillel, and Hillel having taught him the golden rule about don't do unto others what you would not have done to yourself. But before he came to Hillel, he came to Hillel's contemporary, Shammai. And Shammai chased him away with a builder's stick. Imagine, if you will, someone comes to your door and asks for a donation. You give them £5 and they turn around and say, is that it? Can you do more? We've been through the experience. But when you hand him £20 and he says, can't you make it 1,000? You then tell him where to go, maybe even to get lost. You might find yourself closing the door in his chutzpah face. But I seriously doubt anybody would start chasing him down the street with a stick. That would require anger management. Again, we know that this man went afterwards to Hillel, who gave him that instruction. Don't do unto others what you would not have done to yourself, which is the principle of love your fellow as yourself. What's happening in this story? And the answer lies in a tiny detail referenced in the story. When the Talmud bothers to tell us how Shammai chased him down the street with a stick, and it doesn't just tell us it was a stick, but it tells us it was a measuring stick. Who cares? What's the difference if it was a builder's measuring stick or a cricket bat? But the point is this. Shammai wasn't really chasing the man away. He was looking to teach the man a fundamental lesson in life. If you want to embrace the faith, then the first thing you have to learn is how to embrace the no before you can embrace the yes. In other words, if you're going to embrace the yeses, things that appeal, the things that you like, but you're not going to embrace the no's, the things that you can't do, the things that you shouldn't do, much as they don't appeal to you, then you have a problem. If you're only going to embrace the yes, you're going to go to the gym 3 times a week, but you don't embrace the no, because you're going to have pizza for lunch, fried fish for dinner, and ice cream for dessert every single day, then not only will the gym not achieve its intended results, but over time, you won't experience the benefit and you will give up. That's what Shammai is looking to teach this man. By taking the builder's measuring stick, he's saying, if you want to build a meaningful, spiritual, measured existence, then the starting point is chase away, as he was chasing him to teach him, the negatives before you embrace the positives. The yeses of life can be appealing. The no's, we all struggle with those. But Judaism is not a pick and mix. The starting point is Kabbalah Sol, harness the yoke. Accept and embrace the no's, whether they appeal or not, whether they make sense or not. Then thereafter, he goes to Hillel to learn about the yeses and the positives as well. And as much as this applies to our general observance and religion in general, it also applies to the other dimension of life. In other words, beyond observance, life events, there are all kinds of experiences that we endure in the journey of life, not least the very threat to man's mortality. And we find ourselves challenged and sometimes wondering and sometimes asking and sometimes overwhelmed. One very famous biblical story is the tragic, untimely passing of Aaron's two sons. And his response then in that moment, as the Torah tells us, was he remained silent. He was pained by this ineffable experience, but there was nothing to say. He mustered the strength to just accept his fate, knowing that whatever this is, it's part of a plan beyond human comprehension. Curiously, right after that story is told to us in the Torah, we're introduced to the laws of kosher. Why the juxtaposition? I suggest to you because kosher is a statute. Why can't I mix milk and meat? Why is a cow okay but a horse not? And eating is something we do every single day, constantly. It's something that we essentially take for granted, and yet all of the time we are adhering to something that makes no sense, and we do it because God said so. You'll stand there at 11 o'clock at night in Heathrow or airport because your flight is delayed by 4 hours. You didn't listen to your wife or your mother or take a snack with you, and the only available food is an open hot dog stand that everyone is lining up by, but you'll still rather go hungry. Why? In other words, without necessarily even realizing it, our lives are governed daily by accepting something that we otherwise don't typically get and understand. That was the most appropriate mitzvah to include Aaron and his family with, because life is full of experiences, as they came to learn in their own tragic way, where sometimes we have no choice but to accept the unacceptable. Does that mean we can't challenge? Does that mean we cannot ask? Most certainly not. Elie Wiesel, who endured the depths of hell, sitting in the pit of Auschwitz, said you could either love God or you can hate God. You just can't ignore God. In other words, if you can still love God, you accept, irrespective, and all the power to you. On the other hand, if you get angry, frustrated, why me? That's also okay. But because there's passion that can always be channeled back in the right direction. You just can't ignore God because it doesn't make sense that when something now happens that is beyond your comprehension, you don't get it, albeit it's part of God's plan to suddenly say, therefore, God doesn't exist. Life is a series of events. And until we've reached the end of the series, it's hard to know why things are happening. Sometimes you'll see it here and other times, in fact, let's be honest, most times you won't see it until the hereafter. If in the process you can still love God, all the power to you. If you get angry, he understands, but you can't ignore. Life is complex. A multitude of questions constantly gnaw at us. Sometimes we are perturbed by the ostensibly prohibitive demands of our faith. Other times we simply cannot properly comprehend the perplexity of the universe and our roles within. Indeed, as we say in our prayers taken from Tehillim, from Psalms, to discuss your kindness in the mornings and your faithfulness at night. There are morning periods in our lives when things are crystal clear. And there are night moments in our lives when things are dark or bleak. In the morning, we talk about God's kindness. It's obvious for one and all to behold. At night, we must resort to faithfulness as we accept the unacceptable. In the final analysis, to doubt is a rational response, but clouded with emotion. To have faith is a supra-rational response, but entrenched in the spirit of intellectual honesty. And whilst it's true that faith always runs the risk of shrinking when washed in the waters of affliction, it's not a pill you take when in pain, but a muscle you use in order to help you rise to the challenges of life. That's the message of our portion. That's the significance of Zot Chukat HaTorah. I wish you all a wonderful Shabbat and a great week ahead. See you all next week.